Welcome, everybody, to Recovery Machine. We're back after the break and somewhere in between Christmas and New Year's. We're both feeling a little slower than usual here, probably from tons and tons of sugar, I would imagine. Maybe that's what it is. Sugar and no exercise, but we're going to do our best here today. So it's me, Nathan, again, and joined, as always, by co-host Corey. How are you doing, Corey?
Good morning. Good morning. I'm doing well. You know, to our credit, Nathan, this is one of the earliest sessions we've ever met for. So we cut ourselves a little slack there. It's 10 o'clock Pacific time. So, but yeah, it's good to see you. Glad you had a good Christmas break. And yeah, so what we're going to do today, we're going to do something a little bit different. You know, we often talk about books that we're reading, talk about it with each other, talk about it in meetings. And we thought it would be kind of a fun idea to highlight a few of the books that we read and were impacted by, particularly early on in our recovery, that we think might be helpful, that we think, you know, could our listeners, whether or not you are in the position that we were in, that it could be beneficial to you in your life. We also, you know, when we were first talking about this, I wanted to set the challenge for you that if we're going to do this, that means no Gabor Mate. That means no Maia Szalavitz, no Carl Hart, none of the sort of the big names that you would expect, because I would assume that a lot of our readers or a lot of our listeners have read some of those people. Those people are wonderful, but let's sort of see what else we can dig up, you know?
Okay, I forgot that we were talking about leaving out those ones. And I have that's okay. I have one that I am currently reading, actually suggested by our friend Peter over in Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it was a great suggestion. It's brand new, hot off the press, and I could discuss that one instead.
Okay, if you're sure, then yeah, let's go for it.
Yeah, I think I'll have to at least mention how this works as far as I've got it in kind of a impact order here, but
okay,
I will adjust on the fly.
Okay, so would you you can choose. Do you want to start or do you want to pass?
I could start. The first one I chose is Addiction: A Disorder of Choice, and that one is by Gene M. Heyman. It's one of the first books that I ran into when I started to, most of my problems occurred and began in 2011. And then once I realized that a lot of the information I was getting from professionals and experts seemed to be misleading or contradictory. And it was then that I decided, well, let's learn as much as I can about this, and maybe I can figure out some of my own way through it. So his book, Addiction: A Disorder of Choice, right here, that's the guy for the video people. I think it's about a dozen years old now, something like that. But the reason it was important for me is because it was the first time that I saw somebody put together what appears to be a bigger collection of studies that are higher powered and less suspect than the ones many of the, like say the DSM-5 uses a certain kind of standard to define addiction, and then it goes on to sort of back that standard up as far as its ability or its power to diagnose individuals by using studies that are mostly, if not all, taken from people who have been in treatment or sought out treatment themselves. So that right there is actually the sticking point, because they use that data and then extrapolate from that to the whole population. And I don't believe that was, I don't think it was meant as a to obfuscate the facts. I don't think the data was available at the time that even during the latest version of the DSM-5. I could be wrong about that. But regardless, what I found in this book was that this idea of powerlessness, where you go to when I went to treatment, it was there were several things that I had trouble with, but one of them was the fact that I was being told that I had no power over this situation, and that just didn't make sense to me for multiple reasons why I was there. At the same time, I knew there was a compulsory component to being addicted to drugs. Something had happened in my ability to control the situation. That was true. But at the same time, I was still able to make decisions. So I was in that gray area without any information. And this was the first time I came along and saw, oh, wow, this guy is actually, he's done an excellent job of putting together, he points out 4 huge studies in particular that demonstrate that by far the most likely scenario for somebody who is having trouble with drugs or alcohol is that they remit. And it's not a remitting, relapsing situation. It's usually most people in their 20s and 30s. That's when the majority of these problems happen. And once they've addressed whatever motivating factor was involved, or maybe they've moved on and they have new life responsibilities that are putting pressure on them, they don't have the time to maybe party as much as before, whatever it may be, they don't stay in that same addictive behavior pattern. They find a way out of it. And the vast, vast majority do it without treatment or any intervention at all. And it's not even close. It's about 75% across the board if you want to take every substance that people normally have problems with. Going as far as like alcohol, cannabis, and then up towards the harder drugs. So yeah, that was the impact it had. What it did is it made me believe that I wasn't completely crazy, and that maybe there was more to this than I was being told. It's not what we had planned on doing here was reading a quote after the introduction of the book. In this one, it's a pretty technical book. There's not a lot in here that's going to be nice prose for a quote. So what I would recommend people do is, even if they want to take a quick look and just go over the graphs, that's what I would point people towards that. It's absolutely worth the read. And if you haven't seen or aren't aware of how much of a disparity there is between what mainstream medicine says about the condition of addiction and what these bigger, more representative studies that were done around 2000 to 2010-ish. If you're not aware of what they're saying, I would highly recommend that you check this book out. So it's Addiction, a Disorder of Choice. It's not a long read, but it's a bit of a slow read because depending on your ability to kind of sort through trials and studies. But an excellent book. And I think that if you look at most of the authors after Gene M. Heyman, they will have him listed as a reference in their titles. So that's the first one I wanted to mention.
I wanted to ask you, Nathan. You mentioned that book in, I think, your introductory episode, or maybe even my introductory episode. It was within the first 2 or 3 episodes of our podcast. You mentioned that book. At what point had you already been to inpatient treatment, and did you read that book after the fact?
It was after, yeah, because it was when I came out of treatment, I was pretty disorientated, and I needed to know if what they were saying was true in treatment, then my entire kind of I had to make large scale adjustments to many kind of ways that I'd viewed the situation before. And I needed to make large scale adjustments anyway. So it would have been, I think it would have kicked my legs out from me a little harder had I not been able to dig into this stuff and see that, oh, okay, it's not it's not that black and white at all. It's quite subtle, and many people are struggling to, find a definition, even a workable definition for diagnoses of addiction. So it gave me some hope, is what it did.
Mm-hmm. That conversation about powerlessness, I mean, we could go on and on about that. And it, of course, the 12-step model is deeply rooted in that notion of kind of admitting powerlessness. But, and if people grapple with that and it works for them, fair enough. But like, again, it's such a vulnerable time. And like you said, when you were in that inpatient treatment center, without having read that book, without having kind of been validated about what was going on with you, or getting that clarity, it's like you're vulnerable, you're looking for some answers. And I think a lot of people would probably just accept that as at face value. And
yeah. And a lot did, but there were others there who had already kind of been down the path, and they could see that a lot of it was kind of bullshit, right? Or just answers that were, here's an easy answer for you, and if you ask any questions, you're not going to get any further information. In fact, you're going to get shut down for relapse behavior.
Yeah.
So that was I mean, maybe if the facilitators in that place had been a little more forthcoming or willing to talk about why they thought that was the case, and it may be the case for them that they felt entirely powerless. And I believe that there is something to be said for people who have problems with alcohol, particularly because it's the nature of it is that it goes after your ability to make a judgment call immediately. So I think it does have an element of powerlessness to it that is maybe a little greater than some of the other ones in a different kind of way, if you if you can follow that.
I do. And in fact, my second book that I will talk about today very much supports sort of the same conversation, and like how the way we think about an issue or a problem that we're having or an addiction directly impacts our behavior around it, and how we face it. So our thinking and our language are instrumental, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. So what was your I think you're going in the same kind of chronological or impact order as I am.
Yeah, chronological order for me too. So when I encountered each of these books, and the first book is I don't want to say it's simple, but it's not a sort of a heavy science-based statistical book. It's Embers by Richard Wagamese. And holy smokes, I mean, there's so much I can say about this book. So first of all, it was about a month into, not even a month, I don't think, into being off work. And I'm sitting at home and I've got, nothing but time on my hands, and I'm just, wringing my hands in uncertainty and just really distressed and stressed. And my cousin, Jane, shout out to Jane from Ontario, sent me this book in the mail. And Richard Wagamese was an Indigenous Canadian author and poet. He wrote for the TV show North of 60. He wrote the book called Indian Horse, which then became a movie, which is actually on Netflix, I think. And he wrote these poetry books. And what it did for me, and I'll read you one or two examples. At that time when my mind was so busy and so filled with uncertainty and so filled with worry, and particularly at nighttime, I've talked about this, that for me, nighttime, when, the lights are off and it's silent in my place, that's the most difficult time for me. Particularly, it was the most difficult time early on. And that's when my mind would race, and I could just get carried away. And I hadn't learned all of the tools and ways to kind of get myself grounded. So I really found being able to put my attention towards something short and simple and like digestible, that if I was feeling anxious or feeling stressed, that would just ground me and center me. That did a lot for me. Like a piece of music or a familiar song could, or like watching a certain show that kind of just like brings you back to zero. But because Richard Wagamese had lived experience with addiction, with a very difficult, challenging life, that's the perspective that he's speaking from. Someone who's been through the mud and gained some peace. Richard also, by the way, lived in Kamloops, British Columbia. So,
crazy,
a relatively local person for us. And it was just really beautiful, and it was stuff that I could like kind of mull over and read and reread. A couple of these things I've read in my Smart Recovery meetings. I think I read one of them in our Caduceus meeting once. So I'll read you one here, and they're all very, very short and extremely, extremely sweet. And this book, Embers, is broken into little passages about stillness, harmony, trust, reverence, persistence, gratitude, and joy, which are interesting values to sort of reflect upon. So this one goes like this. Watching morning break, I realized again that darkness doesn't kill the light. It defines it. I believe that now. For years, I didn't. I believed that it was my failures, mistakes, misjudgments, shortcomings, and wrongs. But I'm not those things. I am the light that shines from my faith, my courage, my willingness to be vulnerable and to be responsible and to be accountable. Moments of darkness only highlight that truth these days. I'm moving beyond my shame. I'm basking in the light of my own recovery and the brilliance that comes from allowing myself to be seen as I am, warts and all. I'm not just those warts either. I'm the frog who wears them, gradually becoming the prince. So that's that. And I guess I'll ask you first, how does that hit you?
Well, it's a pretty remarkable piece of writing there, just for me personally, because he's talking about vulnerability, he's talking about faith. These are things that those are two of my primary tenets. That especially the vulnerability one came later, but it was tied into accepting the darkness and actually seeking it out sometimes in some ways, and realizing that we don't just grow in the light. In fact, the biggest leaps sometimes are made in the darkness, and it caused, I think of him reconciling this reality as a place that is designed to facilitate struggle. And I think that there's a way to embrace it that is hopefully not overwhelming and doesn't end in, I mean, there is such a thing as struggling too hard, right? If somebody ends their life because they're trapped in the darkness and they can't see their way out. Obviously that's, you can get esoteric about it, but for our purposes, I think that we would call that a tragedy. But from my experience, it's been, there's two ways to look at that. And if we try to take it as something that we're going to spend a lot of time fighting against, as in, I don't want to be a bad person. I don't want to think about the things that I did wrong. I want to distance myself from the darker sides of myself and only focus on the good and the more noble aspects of me. And there's many traps in there. And it seems that he's kind of trying to articulate his growth in that process and his increase in understanding, and maybe seeing himself as more of a whole and seeing the world as more of a, let's see, of course it's more nuanced, but it's not as simple as just, gritting and grinding it your way through and trying to always do the right thing. I think it's about staying open and seeing yourself as, we're all flawed beings, but that's kind of the point, and maybe that's what he was driving at there.
Yeah, I agree. And for anyone who has experienced starting out and having to attend a meeting, like a any kind of support group, a recovery support group, or a 12-step meeting, or a grief support, anything like that. It's terrifying those first few times. And you think, you're hearing people tell their stories, and you think, oh my God, I've gotta, like, how much do I have to tell here? And at first, I think typically from my experience and what I've observed is that people are, tell a very kind of guarded version of their story or what they're comfortable with initially. And then as they get more comfortable, maybe they share more and they open up. And I think the really special thing about those communities can happen when people look at their vulnerabilities, look at their, again, shortcomings, that he's sort of redefining them as he's not owned by his failures. He's growing out of them and remodeling. And and when you can see that happening in a community, and when the other members of the community are supporting the person who's being vulnerable in that, it's just, there's nothing like it that I've ever experienced before. And that's where I think, like, everyone needs to be a part of a community. That's just such a basic human need, and a community that hears them and where they can be that vulnerable. And I wish it didn't take me into sort of coming through addiction and coming out the other side to learn that. But that's one of the most beautiful things that I've learned in this.
Yeah, I agree. It's something that's completely missing from our mainstream kind of way of living here in the West.
Yeah.
We just, it's the individualistic achievement style. I don't need anybody to win kind of attitude. And I don't know. Yeah, we've lost it for quite a while. But when you see it working, like you said, I mean, when you get a group that has gotten to that point where everybody knows that everybody's on the same page, and there's a level of openness there that probably not a lot of people experience. Maybe if they're lucky, they would experience it with their spouse or their best friend type of thing. But other than that, and even those people might not understand if it's something that's, emotionally significant or one of those experiences that you have to go through to understand.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great one, man. I like it.
A little bit different. Thank you. What you got for number 2?
Well, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to give a quick hat tip to Maia, because we all know how I feel about her, and that, I have a shrine and all that kind of stuff. No, I don't have a shrine, but she's I don't have a shrine, folks. She's a genius is what she is. She's a legitimate genius. And Unbroken Brain may have saved my life. So I can't, and I don't know if I honestly don't know how dramatic I'm being there, because I was way into, I had, gotten to a point where I was very isolated, very alone. And when you get down into the darkness like that, her book Unbroken Brain, A Revolutionary New Way of Understanding Addiction, was the one that, and I've talked about it many times, and I still smile thinking about the fact that we actually had her on the show. What an amazing experience, and so grateful. It's just one of the coolest things ever. But I'll just read I'll say first that what she did is she made me understand in a way that nobody else. She put together a cohesive piece of writing that shows you definitively what is going on in your brain. And that's what I wanted to know. It made sense. It was backed up by science, and it was just beautifully written. If you haven't read that book and you're wondering what's going on with, you want to see somebody who understands addiction on a deep level, I've said it before, but you got to read Unbroken Brain. I'll read just a little bit here.
Please.
Fundamentally, addiction is a learning disorder. There are 3 critical elements to it. The behavior has a psychological purpose. The specific learning pathways involved make it become nearly automatic and compulsive, and it doesn't stop when it is no longer adaptive. So she takes those 3 and goes wide open on them and backs them up, but that's the bones of it. And how does that, since the experience of having her on and everything we've done there, and with that little piece there, is that something that's evolving? Is it something that, what's your thoughts on that, Corey?
Well, she's answering the question there that so many, particularly loved ones of someone with addiction, ask, like, why can't they just stop? And why many people in active addiction ask themselves, like, we knew that it wasn't working for us, like in the large scheme of things, that it was no longer an effective adaptation. It was for a period of time, in terms of like that, getting through that acute stress or whatever was happening in our heads. But then I could certainly see that, like, this is no longer an effective behavior for me to pursue, but like, why can't I change that? So that's what she's exploring there and answering.
And it's if you don't have that piece of understanding of the puzzle, then I think what happens is you don't have a foundation on which to stand against many of these wild ideas that get tossed around and backed up over the years without any science, and ideas that don't make a lot of sense intuitively. You think about it and you're like, well, it's not exactly like that. That doesn't really define it for me, or there's more to it that's not being discussed. How come we can't discuss it further? And that's what she does.
Yep.
This is a brilliant mind that goes deep after experiencing, being chronically and compulsively addicted to cocaine and heroin, and then, figures it all out in a crazy fast period of time. And then is able to, the amount of her output of writing on the subject matter is staggering. But amazing woman. So that's my hat tip to her. And yeah, I'm sorry I don't. We probably talked about not having the regular books in there, but
that's okay. Do you want to do your another one too?
Yeah, I can. I'll finish. I'll do my next one, and then I'll talk briefly about the one I'm reading now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So we'll move it back to you, sir.
Okay, so mine is another curveball, sort of, in that it's not about addiction, it's not about recovery, but it is about our brains, and that's what we're trying to answer here. And it's The Whole Brain Child by Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson. Dan Siegel's a very well-known psychologist and child psychologist, and has written a number of really sort of instrumental parenting books. And you're going to say, well, why are we talking about a parenting book here, Corey? Well, I read this fairly early on in recovery, and then one of my counselors had recommended it to me as well. So, in short, The Whole Brain Child, he's talking about 4 children, how the pathway between right and left brain is underdeveloped, and between lower and higher brain is underdeveloped. So when a child gets into the state of emotional distress or stress, they aren't able to regulate that, and they go from the basement to the upstairs, rapidly. And so the idea is that you sort of take them out of that environment, help them to kind of recenter and to calm down before the lesson is taught, or before the behavior changes. Where it applied to me was, Dan Siegel talks about the wheel of awareness, and he uses the term mind sight. So if you imagine your awareness, all of the things in your life that you put your attention toward, your career, your family, being off of work, your addictive behavior, your money stress, your diet and exercise, any of those things, grief, those are around the outside of the wheel. And then on the inside of the wheel is sort of your mind, where you are. It's the hub, as he calls it. And that is directly impacted by where you. And so if you're always pointing to your addictive behavior or how much you hate your damn job and your boss and your anxiety or your symptoms of PTSD or your symptoms of depression, that of course changes how your mind, how your perspective on the middle is impacted. And so that in fact, we require a much more balanced wheel of perspective and need to ensure that we are putting our attention onto things that also create some balance and that give us a perspective of better health. So, and this is where, thinking about recovery burnout is a common term that I have heard. It's something that I felt probably in the first 2 months, where it was like, you have to go to, because you're in a monitoring agreement, you have to go to what works out to be 4 meetings a week, plus therapy, plus a rehab program for some people. It's a lot. Like, all of your attention is on your addictive behavior and on your work stress and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's trying to get you healthier, but it's not creating a particularly balanced perspective. And it can be pretty dark and get kind of pretty gloomy. And it's not necessarily all, it's not looking at the total picture. And so for me, it helped me to sort of see that, there's the life balance wheel where you can like see how much time you're giving and how satisfied you are with your job or with your home or with your family life or your romantic life, whatever. But this is just about sort of how much time, being aware of how much time and perspective you're giving to each of these things.
Yeah.
So it was a really very helpful reminder for me. And then I think it also really affirmed for me that, like a kid who's having a tantrum in the grocery store, sometimes you got to take them out of the grocery store. Sometimes you got to take them out of the playground and move them aside. And I think it affirmed for me that, like, taking myself out of that environment was so necessary.
Yeah.
And not because my work or my employer insisted on it, but because that was what was going to allow me to recenter and re-regulate and feel better.
Yeah. Yeah. When you put it like that, it sounds almost ridiculous that's not the not the immediate solution, eh?
It does. And there's also, I was trying to think of what part to read, and I encourage everyone to look up his wheel of awareness, and there are diagrams online that where you can find it and look at it more closely. But he also talks about distinguishing between feel and am. And he's talking about teaching this to children, the difference between I am feeling sad versus I am sad.
Right. And
this comes back to, as adults, we have a lot to learn about that, about like how our language impacts our being. And we can catch ourselves using that type of language a lot, where it's like, I am an addict, for example.
Yeah.
And what that impact is versus just the current state that we're in. Saying that I am this creates like this permanence. And
it does. Yeah. And we've seen
sort of self-defining, self-fulfilling kind of a thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. The science is there to back it up too.
He's talking about a child named Josh. Josh is sort of the example in this chapter. Josh's suffering was a result of being stuck on the rim of the wheel of awareness. Rather than perceiving the world from his hub, so the center, and integrating the many points of his rim, he directed all of his attention towards just a few particular rim points that created an anxious and critical state of mind. As a result, he lost touch with many of the other parts of the rim that would help him experience a more peaceful and accepting state of mind. This is what happens when kids aren't working from an integrated wheel. Just like adults, they can quickly become stuck on certain rim points or a few particular aspects of their being, which often leads to rigidity or chaos. It leaves them confusing the difference between feel and am. When a child experiences a particular state of mind, as a feeling of frustration or loneliness, they may be tempted to define themselves based on that temporary experience, as opposed to understanding that's simply how they are in that moment. The danger is that a temporary state of mind can be perceived as a permanent part. The state becomes seen as a trait that defines us. And it goes on there. So I think there's a lot for adults in general to learn about that, but a lot of people in recovery to learn about that too, that we kind of can take on this identity based on the language that we use.
That is a brilliant way to set the system up there, as far as trying to. I mean, I don't know what kids are capable of as far as making that connection, because many adults are unable to, get to that point where they can see that there's something outside of them that's happening, and then reduce it down to a sort of core that is being affected by these things due to it's more of a management issue at its core, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of growing up, but many, again, because we've lost I think it has to do with community and our maybe having a practice of meditation, a daily meditation would increase your ability to be aware of the difference between what you are in the center or the hub, I guess, as he's saying, as opposed to out on the rim there.
Yeah.
It's also interesting because it speaks to the loss of awareness that happens when we get in that dark place. Mm-hmm. So if you were anxious or angry, and that's the last feeling that you had as you retreated inwards towards that hub, as the darkness, you could kind of think of it as a flashlight against a wall, moving away, and the beam is getting narrower and narrower, or like a bullseye even, where the darkness is creeping in kind of section by section until you're just in your hub. And because there's nothing else, all your options, all your things that would balance you out, all your points on the rim, like he's saying there, that would be your normal kind of anchors or way to climb back out of the darkness, are now, you're blinded to them.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting tool. I'm going to have to look at that.
So two thoughts I had. I recall what I was trying to say a moment ago, was that going back to the language of powerlessness, and to say, I am powerless.
Yeah, it's brutal, right?
And it really does sort of fulfill that state of being, and isn't particularly helpful. I feel, when I am having an urge or a craving, I feel powerless.
Yeah.
But I am not powerless, to me, is a healthier way to say it. And the other thought I had, Nathan, was when we are drug seeking, or when we are having a craving or feeling anxious and looking for relief, we tell ourselves in that moment that the drug of choice will take us out of it. It'll take us to a different place. But if you think about the wheel of awareness, to me, the drug is right next to anxiety and trauma and all of these harmful, scary, shitty feelings that I had. So they were intertwined. So it was not a different perspective that I was actually attaining. I think I thought that it was a different part of the wheel, but for me, at least, they became so conjoined and so intertwined that I was always pointed towards the same thing. I was always pointed towards that stress and anxiety and angst and dissatisfaction.
Yeah, that's what we do, I guess, when we're in that state and you're using that drug in a not how that drug is supposed to be used. It causes it almost makes a shadow effect, where now you've retreated back into the darkness and you're oscillating between anxiety, depression, fear, whatever it is, and your drug of choice. Mm-hmm. And you can see how that pattern would develop. And then once you're locked in, you can't see your way out of it because all your other access points are blinded, right? And that you can see that play out time and time again.
Yes.
It's also interesting because you can see how it's not just the drug, right? The drug can be taken out of the equation. That's why you can have these different addictive behaviors. It's your relationship with that behavior pattern that sets up that kind of oscillation and then cuts off the rest of your normal anchor points to whatever makes you feel good. So, it would explain why so many people can use drugs like cocaine or even heroin recreationally, because they didn't go into the relationship with that kind of a dynamic.
Yeah.
Right. They probably went into the relationship with all they were in a healthy place. They experience whatever the drug is for, whatever positives it has to offer, and then don't retreat back into the middle and just sit there and wait for the drug again. They just go back to their business.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. It's like to make a pop culture reference. It's like, why did heroin kill Kurt Cobain and not Keith Richards? Well, all of their life experience that led them up to being, rock and roll stars, impacted that. And the psychological groundwork that was laid before they got to that place impacted the relationship with drugs. Keith Richards was, and still, he not that he's using drugs now, but he was having the time of his life. He isn't. I don't think Keith is. He was having the time of his life, and Kurt Cobain was medicating for his pain.
He was, yeah.
And that's a very sort of simple example of that, but you're so right.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. There's a lot of thought experiments that could be taken out of that for sure.
Yeah,
that's a really cool, real cool introduction there, man.
Cool. So what else have you got here for us?
Well, what I wanted to definitely present as something that people should take it's not something that you're going to take a quick look at, but the Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley is, I got to say that it's the most amazing book I've ever read. That's all there is to it. I don't know how I'm going to find a book that's more amazing than that. And I've went through the Bible with a fine-tooth comb, read it front to back and studied it. Same with the Quran. There's lots more religious texts that uncanonical books and stuff like that. And not that religious books are necessarily going to be your most earth-shattering, but what I'm saying is that in the grand scheme of everything, as far as what's going on here, having a spiritual foundation, a spiritual understanding of the common threads between the different major religions in the world and belief systems, things that stand the test of time, going back thousands of years, things that can be used as points of reference now, and wisdom that just is never going to go away in this reality, because I believe that a lot of the points that are kind of whatever you want to call it, elucidated or made accessible by Huxley in this book, they're pieces that you can take, read it maybe 3, 4, or 5 times on different occasions, and then on the 6th or 7th time, you're like, holy shit, okay, I understand, and now I understand something, a thread of truth that is far beyond anything that I've ever been able to gain from reading a book. It's it's a miraculous piece of work. And it's one of those things that you could just have laying there, open it up anywhere, start reading. And I mean, you'll be thinking about it for the rest of the day. So I've got a piece here that speaks towards my epiphany with charity and my understanding of humility and tranquility and disinterest with material possessions and desires of this world. And so I'll read it here. I was going to edit it down for you a little bit because it's a little long, but here goes. The distinguishing marks of charity are disinterestedness, tranquility, and humility. But where there is disinterestedness, there is neither greed for personal advantage nor fear for personal loss or punishment. Where there is tranquility, there is neither craving nor aversion, but a steady will to conform to the divine Teo or Logos on every level of existence, and a steady awareness of the divine suchness and what should be one's own relation to it. Where there is humility, there is no censoriousness and no glorification of the ego. You just are. Or any projected alter ego at the expense of others, who are recognized as having the same weaknesses and faults, but also the same capacity for transcending them in the unitive knowledge of God as one has oneself. And God there is obviously up for interpretation, but I feel that they're talking about a certain flow. Like I like that logos word in that it speaks towards the connectivity of all living beings, maybe everything that exists in this reality. And then kind of gives you some accountability for, treating people well and understanding really why that matters on a grand scale. But I know that was super long and there's some crazy words in there. But what are your thoughts, sir?
So is he suggesting essentially that we are our own enemy, and that if we can get ourselves out of the way and get our psychology out of the way, that is where the virtue lies? Is that in essence what he's saying?
That is a huge part of it. This is where like Buddhists and Buddhists that's probably the best example of that they speak of this complete ego death. Same with people who've experienced, I don't know if you, how much psychogenic, mushrooms and LSD and stuff like that you've experienced, but I have been to that place where there is, I had an experience once where I was stripped down to this, I watched the layers of myself fall away over a period of about 8 hours. It was a Ibogaine experience, and I don't think I'll maybe again I'll find the courage to face that place again. But I've never had an experience where it was so obvious what was going on, and that when you could see those layers fall off and see all these different kind of masks that you wear to the lies that you tell, the exaggerations, the nonsense, all these things that you think matter, you watch them fall away to the point where you think you're going to die because you think you need all of those little things to continue in this world. And it reduced me to this just pillar of, it was like just light, I guess, just a pillar of light. And I felt that pillar of light was connected to what they call in this book, the divine ground. And this might, I realize here that I'm starting to sound a little bit out there for some people. That's fine. But what it seemed to me was happening there is if you picture, say a big piece of ground with icicles sticking up. That to me felt like my connection with other living things. I was one of those points of light that was embedded into that divine ground, and the divine ground went on forever. And that material there is during that experience, it was a representation of our nature here as that individual form being connected to our nature everywhere here, and then somewhere else also that was actually generating that divine ground. So it goes off in every direction, and then at some point you realize that there's a dimension to it that you can feel is attached to it, but you can't really see it here in the way that we think of seeing. And this speaks to that, I think. And when you talk about taking yourself out of the equation, I mean, it's perfect. You know, if you can remove all the nonsense and realize how connected we all are to one another, and to what feels like something else as well, like maybe something that was involved in the creation of this reality, or maybe some kind of a force, whatever this logos thing is. That's and I don't care. I don't need to know what that is. That was the other lesson there. I'm just fine with it. I'm fine that it's given me an understanding that it's given me the ability to act lovingly towards other people, not feel love, not feel like, how come I don't feel love for other people? That's not the only form of love. In fact, it's one of the lower forms of love. It's that ability to understand that you have the ability to act and cultivate love as an action towards other people. And it's very hard to do that if you're holding on to all that, like you said, getting in your own way with all that kind of extra stuff that's nonsense. You know, it's okay. We all do it. But to see it for what it is, I think gives you a much better foundation to work with moving forward.
So when did you came to this most recent, the Epiphany episode that we did about charity, but when did you encounter Huxley, and how did the experience that you're speaking of with Ibogaine, did that come before Huxley, or what's the chronology there? I'm curious. Well,
if you go back to my original story there in episode 2, I think I mentioned I was staying at my friend's place. I was in a real bad spot, and I probably referred to it as a dream or something.
Yeah.
And the reason I did that was because I wasn't clear on, I hadn't made up my mind as to whether it would be beneficial for people who are listening to this to know what really happened there, or if it was enough for people to just know that I had some sort of an awakening or an epiphany. And what I had decided to do there, because I was basically in a corner and I was in the hub of darkness and felt that I didn't have options. And I reached out to somebody because I'd researched Ibogaine as a molecule. I believe it's an African, I think it's a tree in Africa. And they use it for religious ceremonies and stuff like that over there. And one of the trademark things about it that I wasn't told this until I experienced it, but there's a drum beat that goes on in the background, the whole experience. And at first I thought it was my heart. And then when the thing starts going like, you're like, oh shit, I'm going to die. Right. And then you realize, okay, no, it's not that, it's something else. And there's no explanation for whatever that is. And anybody out there who has been to, there's Ibogaine treatment centers in South America. So some people have had amazing results with just basically walking into these places while actively addicted to heroin, for example, and then walking out and just giving up heroin. And I didn't believe that was possible. I thought it was, sounded pretty over the top, but I tried this stuff, and I understand now why. I see what the mechanism of action would be if you want to talk in pharmacological terms. And what it does is it takes away all the nonsense. So it shows you and in a fashion of, like, I mean, I've done LSD. I'm fairly experienced with like psilocybin and stuff like that, but this was a different level of hallucination, and it was a different level of experience in that I couldn't say for sure whether I was going to live or die. So there was a lot of fear there, and nobody had known that I'd taken this stuff. So it's theoretically possible that I could have died. And it was long, like it was 8 to 12 hours. I can't tell or remember for sure, but
oh my God,
it was long. And when I came out of it, I kind of snapped too. And I was like, holy all this stuff I'm doing is so stupid. What am I doing? I'm not telling my parents about what's going on. But kind of, they love me. Why wouldn't I do this? So I immediately went and called my parents and told them exactly what was going on.
Wow.
Yeah. And then I looked at these things that I was doing, and I was just like, this is enough. This is enough. It's got to stop. These things that you think you care about are, yes, they're real and they're meaningful and they have some application, but on the grand scale, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. Yeah. You're basically killing yourself for money. That's what you're doing, Nathan. Is that what you want to do? Do you think that's fair to your parents? Do you think that's fair to the people that love you? Come on, get your head out of your ass, buddy.
Yeah.
Do something about this, right?
Yeah.
So that's what it did, was it made it so that there was no more argument back and forth in my head. Should I do this or should I do that? It just was, go do it.
Yeah.
So
wow.
you could tag whatever kind of value you want to that. And I will say that it definitely, I'm glad that I had the experience. You can't approach those type of whatever you want to call them, plant medicine, pharmacological agents. I believe they are due a tremendous amount of respect. I believe they're tools that can be used to, in my situation, it got me out of that hub and it put light everywhere, right? It was just a flash of light far beyond the rim of what, so you could see out in every direction, and you're looking and you're exposed in the darkness, and there's nothing left but whatever that white core or bright thing we are in the middle. That's all that was left. And then what's the argument? It's just stop being silly and, get some help. So, yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say here is I don't necessarily endorse that as I don't know what would happen for people or listeners. If you're thinking of doing something like that, please do it with somebody who knows what they're doing. And I wouldn't recommend doing it alone. Same with ayahuasca, DMT, any of these types of things. And my God, don't go in there thinking that you're going to have it's not a recreational situation. And please don't take that. I don't believe that's what it's for at all. So yeah, if you go in there with a heavy ego, it will beat you down. Tear that off. And that is a hard experience to stomach.
So you had that experience, and then in reading Huxley, who's pretty notorious and famous for his, being such a sort of a founding father of psychedelics and of writing about it for sure, and influenced, Timothy Leary and Jim Morrison and all of these people. Ram Dass. When you found Aldous Huxley, did it kind of click like, holy smokes, I've been there. I know what this guy's saying.
Oh, always. Yes. Yeah. I've always had that relationship with Huxley.
Yeah.
The reason, like, the reason I like him so much specifically out of those guys, and I mean, there's different people who are on that same path, and I just learned a new terminology for it. Actually, Ram Dass has a great terminology for it. He's me and a friend were trying to figure out what you would call it when somebody is maybe more aware of this path that they're on, as opposed to somebody who is completely unaware of that path. And what the Buddhists believe that like the Dalai Lama is always born on the path way ahead, right? Each iteration or incarnation, that being understands where it is, in comparison to somebody who is, you could say they're a new soul. That's like a kind of a pop cultural reference. But what I think sums it up best is some people have thinner veils. And in the mystical cultures, the ones that embraced mysticism, that would mean that you are closer to finishing whatever this is, or finishing this revolution of it.
Yeah.
So like a Buddhist would say, well, this person maybe has 1 or 2 lives to live. Their veil is so thin, their ascension is imminent, right? And that would be I look at that as that white light that's attached to the divine ground would just reassimilate into the ground. And then something happens perhaps that is another stage of this kind of reality. Who knows what goes on? Doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. But the understanding of that principle, I think, is interesting, where you can have people who are, and then it also, I don't know if you've ever met somebody who is not being responsible with ayahuasca or one of these like very potent plant medicines. There's a truth to the thinness of the veil there too, because it could be used in another way. Say that you are dangerously close to losing touch with reality.
Yeah.
As in, you're no longer anchored down to this place like you should be, because you're not being responsible with that molecule. So,
and that's what they say. That it can, particularly with LSD, that was sort of the thought that people who overuse it or misuse it can go into a sort of irreparable state of psychosis. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Well, that's an urban myth. They used to say you do a certain amount of acid, then you're clinically insane or some ridiculous thing like that, whatever that means. But yeah, the same type of idea where if you're using a powerful psychogenic like that, there's a podcast with a guy, if we're going to get really crazy here, who, I don't know how familiar you are with DMT, but I guess this guy was doing DMT, smoking DMT, which is that's the psychogenic compound in ayahuasca. Mm-hmm. So when you smoke it, the experience is short. It's only like 6 minutes, but you can have a whole life in that world in 6 minutes. Time is not relevant there the way it is here. So this guy was doing DMT or smoking DMT every day for like months. Mm-hmm. And he was having these encounters with all these entities. And eventually, I guess, because when you smoke DMT, it's a lot of people report a sensation of like leaving the planet entirely. And they're out in this kind of, I don't know, netherworld or whatever. And he encountered a group of beings that had basically like set up a kind of, it sounds like an intervention, but a group of them basically came up and said, look, man, you got to settle down. You're, you've been in here way, way, way too much. You're not here to learn. You're here to, I don't know what you're doing here. You don't know what you're doing here, but you're in serious danger of becoming completely lost. So go home and live your life, and don't come here every day. Don't come here for a few years even. Like they really spelled it out for him, and kind of these were DMT elves apparently, and a group of them bounced him out of the DMT realm and told him not to come back for a while because he'd been abusing it. That's the story.
an intervention within the experience.
Within the experience.
Wow.
Yeah. And I don't know. I'm not haven't been brave enough to attempt that. It's a hell of a lot of, it's hard, I think, to, if you're going to go there and do that stuff, you got to be prepared to face down demons and all sorts of stuff. And I think I'm getting to a good place, but, maybe when I'm a little older and I believe that I run into a stagnant place where I need to open myself up to that again, possibly. But other than that, doing those types of things every day, not responsible.
The other thing it made me think of, Nathan, was that I know it was actually offered to me fairly early on of going off work that there are clinics at least in British Columbia, that offer ketamine infusion treatments for post-traumatic stress.
Mm-hmm.
And that was offered to me and I declined it. But I know that is a paid, I think when it was offered to me, it was actually a trial that they had offered to put me into.
Mm-hmm.
But there was full coverage paid for this experience.
Right.
And I don't know how many treatments they were offering there. I, as an ER nurse, saw ketamine being used for procedural sedations in the ER, for putting someone's shoulder back in place or cardioverting someone.
Mm-hmm.
And it never looked like a pleasant experience. It always looked like a fairly scary, uncomfortable experience. But that's something that is continuing to evolve as a treatment modality and one where there is coverage for healthcare workers and first responders. So,
yeah. I mean, and the results from ketamine, especially the ketamine NAD plus infusions that they're doing for, I think it was, I want to say opiates and alcohol, they were having the most success with, but psilocybin, some of these trials are like the doctors look at the results and they can't believe it. They've never, I mean, it's, so yeah, I think that's in our future. The next 5-10 years, you're probably going to you might even see psilocybin become a covered treatment modality along with some kind of talk therapy.
I wouldn't
be surprised. Yeah,
I agree with you totally.
So yeah, we got pretty derailed there.
I'm just gonna say, now that we crawl out of the rabbit hole that we just dove into.
And we had a big talk before this one about trying to stay on track. And it didn't, but that's fine. I mean, if you don't like that kind of talk, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. But anyway, we'll get back on track here. And what do you got going, Corey, for your...
Well, this next book feels like a complete non sequitur in the conversation, which it is, but that's okay because it's going to take us down a whole other path, I think.
Okay.
It is the third book that I read chronologically in terms of these compared to the other two books, and it is also, I would say, number one in terms of its impact on me. So it's kind of appropriate that I'm touching on this one last. The book is called Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. This came out in 2013. And the title of it is so stale. And I wish Pete titled it something maybe a little bit more inspiring. But it is the most accessible, relatable, easy to read book about and practical book about PTSD, complex PTSD, which I'm going to talk about in just a second here. And then with practical tools of how to combat negative thinking and sort of get yourself out of these cycles of sort of spiraling thinking. It's just so accessible and hands-on. So first of all, complex PTSD, we're not talking about acute PTSD or PTSD from a singular traumatic experience, witnessing a trauma or witnessing a act of violence. It can be that, but complex PTSD refers to a more long-term effect, oftentimes rooted from childhood or early life, traumas that have compounded.
Would this be what most soldiers reporting PTSD? Would they have complex PTSD? Or?
In certainly in some cases,
okay.
It's not referring to, though, like, I was I witnessed one singular event. It's usually sort of a more protracted, compounded life experience.
Okay.
And he gets into it being quite particularly rooted in childhood stuff and developmental trauma that can occur, stuff with authority, but also sort of trauma that, where it's more black and white, like I saw this happen or this happened to me. What he's getting at here, and there's a couple of areas that I wanted to touch on, was the fascinating discussion about emotional flashbacks. And this is, again, unique to complex PTSD, that an interaction or an experience with another person where there's conflict, or where there is a look or a response that you are given, that can without triggering a visual flashback of the trauma that occurred, it can muster up the same physiological response of stress, of anxiety, as the initial event that happened.
Wow. So,
the feeling of being shamed or being ridiculed or being disciplined, and that eliciting sort of the same kind of a feeling that it did when you were a kid.
Man, that is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah. And so I think, what it explained for me was the idea that feeling a certain way, I'll say at work, where, and I think I was personally dealing with both things. So having specific trauma experiences at the workplace where I would have a reminder of those experiences that happened a year or two ago, where there would be like a sensory cue or a visual cue where like another person comes in and there's lots of blood or something like that. But also the feeling of feeling helpless or feeling anxious or feeling out of control could elicit an anxiety within myself or a tension within myself that was actually kind of cueing me back to times that I felt like that as a kid, I think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And is that a common occurrence amongst most people who have that, like the condition of complex PTSD?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll just read you a little piece about emotional flashbacks first here. Emotional flashbacks are perhaps the most noticeable and characteristic feature of complex PTSD. Survivors of traumatizing abandonment are extremely susceptible to painful emotional flashbacks. Emotional flashbacks are a sudden and often prolonged regression to the overwhelming feeling states of being abused or abandoned. These feeling states can include overwhelming fear, shame, alienation, rage, grief, depression. They also include unnecessary triggering of our fight or flight instincts. It's important to state here that emotional flashbacks, like most things in life, are not all or none. Flashbacks can range from intensity from subtle to horrific. They can also vary in duration, ranging from moments to weeks on end, where they delve into what many therapists call a regression. So, I think for me at times, that feeling of there was a lot of violence at work. There was a lot of, and we've in recent episodes have talked about where it wasn't necessarily physical violence, but verbal aggression from patients or family members, say, how that could stir up the same feeling as something that happened at school, or something with the bully, or something with authority, and it wouldn't necessarily take you back to again the memory of that, but these are the same feelings that sort of were conjured up then. And then with that anxiety, with that sort of physiological discomfort, the door is then opened to negative self-talk and the inner critic. And Pete Walker, the author of this book, talks a lot about the inner critic that tape that is constantly playing. And you and I have talked about that for both of us, that the critic sort of knows everything about us, knows our buttons, and pushes them really well. And if you are sort of stirred into a state of anxiety or restlessness or fear or depression, that inner critic can just sort of take off. Mm-hmm. So he presents some really helpful tools of, ways how to talk back to yourself, how to support yourself in talking back to that critic. I think I've given this example in meetings, but maybe it's a good one to give here, that, thinking about anxiety around picking a daycare for my son.
Okay.
And feeling like that my inner critic was telling me, you're putting your son in harm's way, you're neglecting him by putting him into daycare, you're setting him up to potentially be molested, or to have adults who you don't know or trust look after him. And the way I combated that, and I learned this from this book, was to literally tell myself when I'm thinking about that, like, I have good judgment. I trust my own judgment. I can read people. I have the skills and the ability to make the choice that is best for my son, and I will do the best that I can to make that choice. And so, like, literally talking back and pushing that inner critic away, which sounds so hokey, but you've got this tape that's playing negatively. And if you don't push back against that, it can just get absolutely carried away.
It can drive you insane.
It can. And it can lead you towards more anxiety, more depression, more restlessness, more negative, harmful life choices. So just learning to sort of, and he describes it as, self-parenting, self-mothering and self-fathering, where you are the one who's like building yourself up and supporting that inner voice and challenging that critic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to think of it as being your own best friend.
Yes, exactly. And literally talking to that best friend.
Exactly. I quite regularly, there's a couple of me going on inside my head. And one is the more autopilot, and it is more prone to, slip into negative thinking without, just doing it on kind of more like a default setting.
Yeah.
But I've come a long way in training myself to challenge those thoughts as quick as possible.
Yeah.
And you don't have, you can be nice about it.
Yeah.
Okay, Nathan, I see what's going on here. Where's the evidence for that statement? What's says who? That kind of cognitive behavioral therapy type stuff.
Yes, and I think you should be nice in that voice that you talk back to it. And
yeah, otherwise you get into this like back and forth that turns into. You can fuel the fire with that technique as well if you're not careful.
Yes, there's lots in here about how complex PTSD and trauma is connected to self-soothing, addictive behavior initially as a self-soothing mechanism, as a way of trying to ease that emotional flashback, a way to ease that feeling of anxiety or agitation or fear. And again, for myself in the workplace, I think that was so rooted in that. The other fascinating thing that I learned from this book, and we've talked about in our caduceus meetings, we all know fight or flight, or we should know that fairly well, just as like a basic sort of human response to a stressor or a stimuli. Pete Walker really puts in the third F as fawn.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one that I didn't know before. The tendency that some of us have to sort of to placate, to smooth things over, to, instead of, freezing and hiding or running away, you try to pet the lion or try to feed the lion to make it happy, and then it may not eat you.
Right.
And he's in this one chapter of the book, he's talking about, the fawn or flight response as a human characteristic. The title that he gives it, interestingly, fascinatingly, is the super nurse.
Okay, there you go. That's you.
That's me. The fawn flight type is most typically seen in the busyholic parent, the nurse, the administrative assistant who works from dawn until bedtime, providing for the needs of the household, the hospital, or the company. He compulsively takes care of everyone else's needs with hardly a gesture towards his own. The fawn or flight is sometimes a misguided Mother Teresa type who escapes the pain of self-abandonment by seeing herself as the perfect, selfless caregiver, further distancing herself from her own pain by obsessive-compulsively rushing from one person in need to another. Some fawn flight clients also become OCD-like in cleanaholic tendencies. One of my interns told me that her fawn flight client had a dozen color-coded toothbrushes from various micro-cleaning tasks in her family's bathroom or kitchen. Some project their perfectionism onto others. They can appoint themselves as honorary advisors or overburden others with their advice. However, it behooves fawn flights to learn that caring is not always about fixing. This is especially true when the person we are trying to help is in emotional pain. Many times, all a person needs is empathy, acceptance, and an opportunity to verbally vent. Moreover, some mood states also need time to resolve. Loving people when they are feeling bad is a powerful kind of caring. So the super nurse, I mean, and I was certainly one of them. I've known a good number of them where your needs go out the window. Your needs are not even secondary. They're just non-existent. And
right.
And for me, the fawning to say, yeah, I'll take on that extra shift. I'll stay later. I'll do the overtime. I'll look after these 16 patients that are stacked up in a hallway, and I won't even, bark to administration about it or whatever that may be. That need to people please and to fawn in the presence of a stressor, it became so entangled with an emotional flashback and that constant feeling of like stress and anxiety in my body and I was so afraid to face it and to say no, that the easiest thing was to medicate it.
Right.
The most natural, obvious thing was to medicate it.
Yeah. Well, that makes perfect sense. Your tendency towards this super nurse kind of persona, and then you're asking something of yourself that is basically not tenable, not long term anyways. Therefore, the only way to continue on is to medicate.
Yeah. And you know what? This is what I'm going back to our Maia Szalavitz episode, where I had kind of asked her a question about like pre-screening healthcare workers. And she had said, I think you would exclude a lot of really wonderful people from the mix if you pre-screened everyone and said, no, you can't be a nurse. And I most definitely agree with her.
Yeah.
But I do think tying it all together, it's a conversation that should be had in universities.
Yes.
Or in high schools or elementary schools even. But at the very least, in universities where people are directly going into a profession that will put them at risk.
Yeah, it's a tough one, because how do you get people to understand the danger they're in? Like it's a very difficult thing to articulate. It's very personal. And I mean, to have it work effectively, you'd have to somehow communicate to people during the application process almost, because you'd want to say, look, do you accept the risks of your, you appear to be the computer has identified you through an algorithm as a super nurse or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And what are you going to do in these situations? And I mean, awareness is always better than not aware.
Yep.
So I guess you just having that there, it would be a work in progress. It would be a hell of a thing to implement, but I don't think there's any harm in it. I mean, I sure would have liked to. I mean, I think many of us we choose paths that, I mean, you don't want everybody trying to prevent everything, but if you know that you're going into a specific area of danger, and there seems to be a common occurrence of, like what's happening to nurses right now is the best example I could think of. I mean, there should be more being done in the beginning to address that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And we can't, when I say we, society or a health authority can't take responsibility for everyone's, psychological background and can't sort of try to rectify, every piece of childhood trauma or PTSD that preceded their employment. Like that would just be impossible and unrealistic and just too much. Mm-hmm. But I think to understand that people are coming into that profession or into that shift or that experience with the context that makes them who they, all of these things that make up the fabric of their psychology and of their mind and their reactions, and that not everyone can just sort of brush it off. Mm-hmm. And that is what is expected of people. And it kind of comes back to peer support. It comes back to discussion.
Yeah.
But again, I that's something I wish I had have learned much, much earlier in my career, for sure.
Completely understandable. And we can do a better job there. I know we can. I did want to mention, since you chose a PTSD format book to end with there, for people who are interested, the company that I started, Obsidian Support Services, Corey's going to help me out with that, and Corey will be facilitating a new group that is going to be, or groups, depending on how many people sign up. It's going to be centered on PTSD, and it will be the same as the other type of groups in that it's a peer support based model. It's not a hierarchy. It's not a top down. It's not a here I'm the expert, listen to me thing. It's a bunch of people getting together online, exchanging ideas about what works for PTSD, or just talking about what's not working at the time and finding support in others. Because that's that community that we're talking about and we're trying to build. So yeah. Corey's going to take that on, and we're going to start that in the new year. Hopefully have something up and going by, I'd like to by the end of January. I think we can make that happen.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So I thought I'd throw that in there.
I'm glad that you did, Nathan. It is, I think it's something that we're still learning about, that society is still learning about, that addiction medicine is still learning about. I look at the fact that workers' compensation organizations in our country and in our province are now understanding and accepting that there's a correlation between PTSD, complex PTSD, and addiction, and are supportive of that. That in itself is a milestone, and
it is. That's good to see.
It's good to see it. It's a relatively new, a new sort of approach that is being taken there, because I think it's what we've learned is that people have had such a vast array of experiences that got them to that place.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's threads of commonality that can be. I mean, we could take advantage of these things in community with community support. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I guess what I'll do is just mention this last book here again. Thanks to Peter for pointing this one out. It looks good. I've only went through the first little bit, but it's this author Carl Eric Fisher. Fisher is the last name, and it's called The Urge: Our History of Addiction. And it looks like this guy spent about 10 years just really going deep on, all these, you talk about the old campaigns and patterns of drug, they like to call drug epidemics, and to see how far back this pattern that we've been in goes is fascinating. And this guy really nails it down and points out some tremendously important science along the way. So yeah, I've got a ways to go on that one, but I do want to mention it because I think it's going to be up there on my list. So take a look at that one. It's called The Urge: Our History of Addiction by Carl Eric Fisher. We'll just give that a mention. And thanks again, Peter.
Yeah, and I'll certainly say to our listeners, we would love to know other books that have got you through a difficult time, or helped you learn something about yourself, helped in your sort of your progress with recovery or healing, whatever that may be. And it doesn't have to be a textbook. It doesn't have to be heavy into psychology. It could be a novel. And there are a handful of novels that I thought about bringing in today too, that it would be for a different discussion. But yeah, whatever has sort of helped you along the way, we'd love to hear about it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Any piece of writing, a piece of poem, maybe something you wrote. It's amazing. It sometimes it comes down to just 2 or 3 lines, right? Mm-hmm. That hit you at the right time.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, this was fun, man. I like this. Good idea. We should maybe do this. I don't know, periodically of some sort.
I think that's a good idea. Yep.
Yeah. All right, we'll leave it there, folks. Hope everybody's having a happy holidays, and we'll probably see you again in the new year.
I think so,
for sure. And I don't think we're going to have an episode in between, so we'll just say that.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Nathan. See you soon.